I think it's been 6 or 7 years since I first was introduced to some of the things that Dr. Solos was interested in with this course. I know that I similarly was moved for years and years to the question, how are we going to deal with the questions that seem to be coming down the pipe in terms of what to do with the new technology? This was something that I'm sure I started thinking about in the 1980s with the advent of technology. I consider myself, maybe I wouldn't call it post-traumatic stress, but I'm a slightly scarred individual in the way I feel let down after the seeming results of the Human Genome Project. It might be on me, but I was led to believe somewhere around 1992, 93, 94, that we were nearing the end of identifying all the genes in the human genome. And I'm pretty sure I heard the so-called experts promise that in the wake of that, most human disease was going to be eliminated. In definitely a sense, if not immediately, soon thereafter. And I was very excited about this as a, I guess going through my mid to late 20s, thinking that this is going to be just great. And then I think it's, I can't remember, 97 or 98 when they announced that it's, we can identify the genes, and I was sitting there waiting for the new technologies, the new interventions to start rolling in. And I feel that in the last few years, with the rise of things like CRISPR, the idea that we probably can begin to manipulate genetic material in a way that we half know what we're doing and might be able to treat things. But I find that I've got a general skepticism about all prediction now. And so that applies across the board. When I hear predictions of how soon the self-driving cars will be coming, I find myself skeptical, and it goes back to that same thing. And it, I think, comes down to an assessment that many of the predictions are simply over-enthusiastic. They're compelling to some degree, but I find my skepticism overrules my optimism when it comes to things like this. So I do suspect that a lot of the actual advances that will happen might be the result of sort of new twists on the technologies that are developed. But I really wonder how it will play out. Listening very carefully to the suggestions that we are on the cusp of a technological revolution, that human life as we know it may well change, not just a little, but fundamentally when we are able to do some of the amazing things that come from advanced computing power, a few more iterations of Moore's Law, where if we're really doubling every 2 or 3 years, the computing power of 10, 20, 30 years from now is indeed astounding. And so there are a lot of reasons to believe that some of the projections are in fact reasonable, and that we have to start preparing for super intelligence and whatnot. I think one of the fun things about ethics is speculative thought. I mean, there are all sorts, hundreds and hundreds of ethical issues worth discussing in the current world. But the what-if questions, I think they're fun to play with. And they require a good dose of imagination. So as I'm going through my thoughts here, please, think about how it affects you. What do you really suspect might happen, and why? So there's two angles. There's that prediction, which you think will happen, And the next interesting question is, well, what should happen? And is that even a question worth asking? Because one might say that while we could identify what should happen, we might not really have the ability to make that happen. And these might just evolve in a natural way. So I've called it the ethics of immortality, a speculation. You know, and calling it a speculation defends me against critique. I'm just using my imagination here. And so see if it makes sense to you. You know, again, these are, it's a complicated analysis. The values that I'm going to attribute to various possibilities are not clear. And so, so see if you can keep track as I go through pros and cons of what the possibility of human immortality. And I guess in some ways I might not be talking about immortality. It might be more like, what if our lifespan were 1,000 years? We could probably take that to immortality, but I'm not sure. So these are just a reminder of some of the means of analysis. And like I've said, I don't think that philosophical ethics, while it's cloaked in big words, is really that complicated. It's a combination of these things. How do we humans assess what's going on and decide what ought to be done? We think about the outcomes. We think about the fundamental principles we're committed to. We think about established rights, professional duties, general human duties, the laws of the land, which are presumably changeable according to new understandings. I've spoken a little bit about narrative ethics, which I think in the end is necessary to figure out how does this stuff fit into the greater human story. Imagining that, what sensibilities might it give us about what ought to happen or what ought not to happen? Because you know, I think, as we've discussed elsewhere, there are many human stories going on. You know, the story within each individual's life, the story you know, of a group like ours or a wider group. You know, the story of Canadians or Albertans living in a certain place and time, in relationship with the rest of the world. All of these simultaneous stories going on. And in the end, I think will such technologies be implemented? If so, widely or narrowly? And I still have this sense that the best answers to the questions will come out of contemplating what are the relevant stories than just focusing on rights, laws, or principles. You know, and in the end, you know, you can foreshadow if you knew me a little bit better, I'm always looking for the middle path. Is there some sort of compromise, you know, based on the assumption that there will be polarized opinions around such things? The idea of total consensus is almost impossible to imagine. And so I wonder if, in the end, some compromise middle path that could satisfy the, I suspect, very strong opinions on both sides. If you ask 1,000 human beings about whether extending the lifespan of humans by 10 times is a good or bad idea, you would get a multiplicity of opinions, including some who would say, you know, no way, it would be the biggest disaster ever, and others saying, of course. So I guess I remain an optimist that even such people could find a compromise. And then wide reflective equilibrium, that just, as we throw all of the possibilities at you, and you're trying to figure out what would you do in your own mind, you should hopefully come to a sense of that the issue is settled, at least tentatively, in your gut. You know, I think the thing about ethical thinking is that it isn't just in the head. There's a big gut component, meaning how we feel, our emotions. We are clearly not purely rational creatures. We are emotional, compassionate creatures. It's essential to our humanity, and how to account for these in such a discussion is the challenge. So here's the scenario with a question. A researcher has discovered a new procedure in which genes associated with the aging of human cells can be adjusted to slow down the process. Animal studies indicate that with a simple injection, lifespan can be doubled, and that a series of such injections seem to be able to increase lifespan 10 times. You are part of a committee charged with making recommendations about whether and how this new technology should be made available. Okay, so I'm not sure how you got on the committee, but you're there, you're sitting at the table, and someone's going to ask you for your opinion of you. So you might regret that you've arrived on this committee, but there's no way out. Any questions about the scenario? Clear enough? I don't know the mechanisms. They might not be relevant. So like I introduced, there are a bunch of means of ethical assessment. And this is just, with each ethical principle, again, the way ethical principles are supposed to work is in any situation, we want to uphold these things. They're things that we're committed to. Without a good reason why not, in any decision regarding medical care, we want to uphold all of these things. And much of the time we can do that. We can do what the patient wants that is also good for them, that minimizes harm and is fair. And so that's why the vast majority of medical decisions that are hopefully made between people that trust each other don't in fact have conflict. And the way these principles are supposed to work is that when they do conflict, by talking a little bit about what each one demands, supposedly one will jump out as being more important than the other in the wake of that. So just thinking of respect for autonomy, which comes with the question, what would autonomous human beings choose? So people who are well informed, people who understand what's being offered, people who have been informed that the risks seem minimal, at least among the animals. And I think it's fairly easy to predict that the autonomous individual, given a choice of would you like to live longer, most people would say yes, thinking certainly of themselves. One of the interesting things about this scenario is I'm not imagining that we're coming to people who are maybe in the last decades of their life and saying, would you like an extra life? In some ways, it's a decision that you need to make earlier. The thing about autonomy is that we have a system that we take great pride in, based on individual rights and the ability to create the way that you thrive in a society, that we really value autonomy in the Western world. We think that if there isn't a good reason why not, people should generally be able to do what they want, as long as it doesn't hurt anyone else. And the question of whether in some ways this hurts other people, I guess is part of what we're saying. But if you just took human autonomy, and that each thinking, informed individual is allowed to make their own decision, it's pretty clear that the vast majority of people would say, bring it on. Again, I can't begin to speculate the extent to which they're thinking of all the other principles in the greater good, but when they're thinking of themselves, they would want that. So beneficence, the next principle. What, in the sense, would be good for humans pursuing this? And so let's just think of the individual human. I think just like anybody who has lived a good life till 60 or 70 would absolutely love to carry on doing so in relatively good health, it seems to be a good. What would the problem be? I think that certainly we tend to enjoy our lives. I think most people find a way to minimize their suffering. And when I say that we enjoy our lives, we also all suffer to a degree. But on the whole, I think for a majority of people, the idea of extra living is definitely helpful. You know, other goods that might come. You know, if you had, you know, in the first scenario, say 150 years to live, and in the second scenario, 800 years to live, is that you would have a much longer time to pursue the things that you want to pursue in your life, to come to the realization and wisdom that, I don't know if you are old enough to realize that you might be a little smarter than you were before, but there are still a million things you'd like to learn. So I'd say for students, lovers of knowledge, the idea of a lot of extra time, the ability to read the full version of all the books rather than the condensed notes version, the idea that you could cultivate yourself personally in a much richer way, all potentially good things. And then when I think of the harms, what might be harmful to humans in pursuing this? I mean, the first thing that comes to mind are logistics. We already, most would say, are fighting with overpopulation. You know, we're sitting somewhere above 7 billion in the world, 7 billion people. Most projections don't think that we would be able to slow that down much before we get close to 10 billion. And certainly a question about resources, literally. Do we have enough food, water, now and in the future? I know I've often thought that maybe we don't. Those of us who went to you know, our elementary and high school in the 70s and 80s learned you know, things, books like The Limits to Growth, and we were warned that the population explosion might become a big problem. So in some ways that hangs over us. I also think of potential harms like the nature of the family and human relationships. You know, what is it going to mean potentially if you don't sort of raise your kids and stay close to them? You know, but if you're 140 and your kid is 125, you know, have you had this close relationship for 100 years? What does it mean to family ties? You know, do they just sort of go on? Just like most people would feel good about having grandchildren and relating to them, would you just instead have or in addition have great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren, and it would just be a bigger, happier family? Or does the size of the family become unwieldy and it might harm human relationships? And sometimes I think of, you know, there are some key things in human life that we have to consider. You know, the nature of how we relate to each other, love and fulfillment, and are these things impacted? So I worry about harms. I worry about our relationships. I worry, you know, about another thing, you know, which I guess gets a little bit deeper into the philosophy. And I would love it if any of you have the answer to this. But something along the lines of, does the knowledge of our own death and its inevitability within the first 100 years profoundly affect the way we live our lives? And my hunch is that it does. That, you know, we know that all of us have this ticking clock. It creates a certain urgency, a sense that each one of us has a limited time, and an acceptance that for now, death's inevitability means that we don't really have such a choice. And we've got thousands of other choices, but the necessity of death remains absolutely there. So other harmful things, you know, when I imagine that, and then just think of certain cultures around the world and how in general we really love life. You know, for good reason, some of the world's major religions see themselves as at the forefront of fighting for the value of human life and whatnot. And you know, it's not surprising that opponents to things like medical assistance in dying and whatnot come from religious sources or sources that see themselves as really committed to life. You know, and I think we have to recognize that huge parts of the world, billions of people, are still guided by those ideas, probably substantially. So one of the problems that pops into my head is, you know, would such institutions insist that life be preserved, you know, as they do now? Because if they did, if the inevitability of death were somehow removed, and that we had to actually accept that we had to decide if death was going to be allowed to come, I can see it creating some difficulties, at least in the traditional sources of authority that we have. And then justice. What impact might allowing this have on our general sense of fairness, you know, fairness of distribution, and in general? And you know, I worry, like I've said, that new technologies like this may well be available, based on the way the current system works, to people who are able to pay for it, or people who are deemed in some way, reasonable or not, to be worthy. You know, maybe we identify a vanguard, an initial group of people to test this out. But I do worry about the justice factor, particularly when it comes to simple numbers. You know, that if this were an easy intervention, one that in theory could be, you know, the active ingredient could be put into a big soup like a vaccine and distributed to everyone in the world. You know, I sometimes worry about what happens to overpopulation then. You know, I mean, it really could get out of control. You know, 7 billion, 10 billion becomes 20 or 30. Hard for us to imagine the Earth sustaining that. But at the same time, you have to imagine that there are currently other technologies, and perhaps it's no problem feeding 20 billion people in the future because of the fantastic new technologies we have and are able to grow food and not destroy the Earth. Again, I worry about that. So these are the initial application of principles, you know, and so I don't know if any one of them screams out as being more significant than the other. I think I worry about the potential harms, you know, and when I give you my conclusions, it'll probably be dominated by that. And you know, and then the other sense of how much of it would be in our control at all. You know, even if you were to decide, no, we're not going to do this, we're not going to allow it, is that even going to be possible? Or does your calculation have to account for the possible reality that once the technology is invented, the genie cannot be put back in the bottle, and it would be short-sighted to think that a total ban or elimination or a statement that thou shalt not use this technology is going to be followed at all. Although, if that's what you decide, it might be the thing to try. I suspect there would be a whole bunch of people who are ill or approaching the end who would go to great lengths to get their hands on the serum. All right, so the next type of ethical situation, which is related to the, you know, what I just said about pros and cons, about benefits and harms. In some way, the outcomes-based ethical decision-making is built into the principlist approach when you think of what is good and harmful. But I think it is helpful to you know, look at what the outcome might be. You know, so how might the good be defined in such a challenge? You know, what is a general good? And humans being alive and being able to enjoy each other's company and pursue their own dreams is an absolute good. In that sense, more of the things we enjoy is to be sought. But if we look at the next question, what might be foreseeable in the wake of one of these decisions? It's where you sort of play out in your mind, okay, well, if we said yes, by all means, what do you envision happening? And if we said no, no way, what do you envision happening? And these things become pretty difficult to give a quantitative value, how good or how bad. But in a sense, that's what you have to do as you're weighing all of these things, because you're on the committee and you've got to vote. So I don't hesitate, like I've described, saying that for many individuals, for many families, it would be nothing but a good. The idea that we wouldn't merely have to know our ancestors and our descendants, either through old pictures or through imagining their future, that we could somehow be in touch with them. We can see as being a very nice thing, putting us in touch with the genetic line that all of us are a part of. We've all got 1,000 generations of ancestors, and hopefully as many in front of us. And we, in some senses, are a link in that chain. I don't know how many worldviews focus on the long chain of life and us being a little link in that. But it's that idea that I worry might be foundational to human experience. But at the same time, the challenge of the modern technology is to lift ourselves out of the past in accepting that we are on the cusp of a fundamental technological change that can potentially change everything. So when I foresee what would happen if our committee said no, and it was sort of decided for reasons of risk or understanding of what human life is, that our mortality is in fact essential. That if death is no longer inevitable, the change to our being would be somehow harmful. I find that worth considering. But again, I don't, so the desire, certainly of individuals to access this technology based on the fear of death, the fear of non-being, which in some philosophical circles is what animates human life, that we all walk around knowing that our end is coming. And so I do worry what might happen. So again, I don't think that alone is necessarily helpful. Part of the problem is that this is very speculative, and without knowing exactly what new technologies are coming down the road, without knowing exactly what our ability to feed people will be, it's hard to have a good sense of what will actually be good or bad. We need to recognize that we're trying to imagine a future based on our current situation. And if you just think of somebody in 1850 trying to imagine the current dilemmas we have in medical ethics or bioethics, you can see that they would be speculating just as much as we are now. But that's the great thing about the human imagination. It allows us to go there and to consider. So narrative ethics, what stories are relevant? So the personal stories of individual lives, each of us has that. We've got a set of parents and grandparents that have a story. It can be a story of where they came from, or what they believed, or what they did. In this part of the world, we tend to see our lives as very often a type of progress, something from less knowledge to more knowledge, less experience to more experience. The so-called idea of linear time, time as progress, going from a state of less organization to greater. But there are a bunch of other stories. So stories that ground close human relationships and families. And this is where I think it's important that we bring in the reality of human emotion and human love. If you watch a lot of, say, movies or television shows, if you read fiction or even nonfiction, biographies, the lives of people, we certainly live in an era where the idea of human love and connection is deemed to be very, very important. If you think of the dystopian future, where if somehow the natural bonds of love were lessened, we often see that as a bit of a tragedy. And this is where, really tough questions. I am pretty much persuaded that humans by nature, and probably all animals, when they procreate and have children, they have a relationship of love with those children. It's not just protection. And that fundamental reality that starts with the care of the parents for the baby, who's completely dependent, and then a sort of dwelling together for years and then decades. I'm not sure to what extent you've read or learned about human love. There are different types, romantic love and brotherly love, and they talk about love for the divine as a slightly different type. But all of these things, I suspect, are really important. And so I think about what impact on those sorts of realities if suddenly we were to live 10 times as long. Are we going to be able to love in the same way? Are we going to be discouraged from that? And what's the size of the loss? And there are even stories of other societies in ancient times where there's been this collective where parents are, or children are taken away from their parents. This idea that, well, let's put all of the children together and raise them as a team, and the group of adults can be parental figures to all of the children. I think they've tried that in certain human societies in a bigger or smaller way. I think at least in some cases it was found that parents do seem to have an attachment to their own children, even in such a situation. And to ask yourself, why is that? Is it a recognition of a genetic connection? Are we human beings, in fact, just vehicles for the perpetuation of a particular set of genes? Or does that represent narrow thinking, that in a broader new thinking would see that every human being is truly a member of our family and worthy of our love? Or is that too grand an idea beyond our capabilities? And then the third type level of story, the larger stories of how human societies ought to evolve, all things considered. This is a very difficult question to answer. I'd say most fundamentally, the story of human beings, if you sort of accept that we've been living on a planet for a few billion years, that we're a particular type of mammal, that a million years ago started separating from other mammals and walking upright and developing a big brain, which led us to the type of domination that we humans have now, and eventually to the ability to actually change nature, not be subjected to it. One thing I'm absolutely certain of is that a future where humans exist is better than a future where they don't, at least from this human being's perspective. So one of the things that needs to be considered in this complex calculation is, what is the threat to human existence in all of this, if at all? I think sometimes that we all have an awareness to some degree that with increased power over the gene, increased power over the atom, things that go wrong in the current world can go very wrong and actually result in our extinction. And that would not have been a remote possibility even 75 years ago. And in some ways, that's what we're dealing with. And when you think of this idea that can we really stop the progress of technology for the sake of some greater good, is that even possible? I would argue that the imperative has never been there before like it is. And just as an aside, I know in the last week I've been having, well, not nightmares, but fears of future human wars. Human war to this date has required human beings to fight it. And that has certainly given leaders a clear sense of the cost of war. We know just how terrible it is. I'm not talking about little skirmish, but full-blown war and the tragedy that that has. And I guess the thought I can't escape is, we're probably not that far away from drones and robots literally being able to engage in those battles that would potentially take over territory, which potentially lowers the cost of war drastically, lowers the cost because you don't have to deal with thousands of your citizens being dead. And when we think of the larger human story and how it compares to the current human story, if in the end the advanced technology results in our extinction, then you've got all sorts of arguments to be made that we never should have gone in that direction. That it would have been better to remain primitive, to not solve the mysteries of the atom and whatnot. And even though we enjoy all the fruits of that, in the fact that we can fight disease, we can, very good chance that we're going to live longer, all of the benefits of technology, if we end up eliminating ourselves, maybe it wouldn't have been worth it. Anyway, so these are the larger stories. And so, when you hear some people saying we need to go back to some more perfect time from the past, and that's the secret to the future, in some ways I sympathize with that, although I would say you're possibly romanticizing the past when you think of that. So just to throw some further considerations, the precautionary principle I mentioned, an idea in philosophy that when an activity raises threats of harm to human health or the environment, precautionary measures should be taken, even if some cause and effect relationships are not fully established scientifically. And so this is, again, in trying to imagine an ethics for the future, I think this becomes a key part of the discussion, and maybe raises the question, well, how quickly do we need to move into that future? Is there an urgency? Is there a crisis? Or, knowing the risks as we might, is there some wisdom in moving slowly, step by step, incrementally, precisely to avoid the potential for enormous tragedy? So in the method of ethics, and again, I would say that I have just tossed a handful of bits of reasoning out at you. If we were to really seriously sit on this committee, I would hope that the committee would meet for a few days and we would go through a lot more details. These are just some initial thoughts which are meant to illustrate what might ethical reasoning look like if done fully. And then how do we add up all the various considerations and come to some decision? Are you moved by what you as an individual would want? Because I suspect you think very strongly that you yourself and your loved ones would want this technology. Or are you moved more by the fears of what might happen? Or is the fact that, well, you think that a small percentage of people in the world could access, but the rest couldn't, does that possible injustice make you think that, well, even though you'd like it for yourself, it's not going to be a good move because it's just going to increase this gap between rich and poor, and in fact make it this whole new class of really old beings, and then the human masses who live regular life things, and how would that go down? So it's hard to know what moves you more, your own needs. But you know, I can tell you that all of us have a bit of selfishness, and if you've got a healthy personality, hopefully a bit of a love of yourself that would make you think, I would like a little bit more life and living. And although I'm concerned about justice, I have to live in my own little world. And so I think many of us in this day and age make decisions based on what's best for us and trust that others will decide what is best for the whole. It's beyond us to really do that. So a middle path, what might a reasonable compromise look like? You know, there are a lot of things that come to mind. One is that the multiple injections where you've got 10 times the life, that is an extreme, that might be too much. When I think about the doubling of the life, I suspect that is conceivably attainable without nearly as big a change as if we lived for hundreds of years. I mean, we already in recent times have gone from an expectation of dying at 60 or 70, an expectation of 80 or more. In some ways it hasn't fundamentally changed things, but I'd say that around North America and Europe, where the lifespans really are that much longer, people for the most part are enjoying them, cultivating more experiences. Some might say that they have a bunch more years of illness and suffering, but I would say on the whole, while it's been some change, but it hasn't been an unmanageable change to extend the lifespan by a few years. You know, and I don't know, I had two grandmothers that lived well into their 90s and seemed to be perfectly fine. You know, I still had, you know, when I was 30 years old, I still had a grandmother, that sort of thing. So I can see us managing that. So a reasonable compromise, you know, might look like something in the middle, you know, that we don't go all the way, but maybe take a few steps, that we in some ways say that this can't be ruled merely by people's decisions, you know, that there has to be some public policy that ideally would become, you know, truly accepted as necessary for the greater good. You know, that although the technology is there for you to get the second and third and fourth shot and extend your life, that you somehow accept the agreed upon rules that just one shot per person, you can just double your lifespan and that's it, and you've got to accept that. It preserves, one could argue, the inevitability of death and all of the benefits that brings in giving us a sense of urgency in life. You know, it's really hard to imagine, I think, what is it you would do for 800 years? Just carry on the same thing, maybe. And perhaps that's good. And if it's just up to you, there's never going to be a good day or week to die. You know, so you can well imagine that if this is ruled by personal autonomy, it will happen. You know, and I would say in some ways that applies to a bunch of the things that we discussed in this course. If left just to the whims of individuals, you know, to buy or avail themselves of these technologies, they're going to want it. So it does raise that question of how much can we even control the rise of technology. And if we feel we can't, you know, do we then have to have a realistic calculation about what we might do, how we can mitigate the potential harms? So my intuitive sense, looking for the middle path, and understanding that it's somewhat arbitrary, is I actually feel good that a life extension of some decades is reasonable, would serve people well. I think enable us to probably fulfill our life projects with a little bit more confidence. There's all sorts of questions. If, you know, so say the average age we're in the wake of this be 130 years, I'd be interested to know whether we could slow down aging so that you're extend childhood and then extend young adulthood? And in particular, could we advance the years of fertility, from the current, where it's, pretty much we human beings need to have children before the female is 40 years old, more or less, for health purposes. It would certainly be easier if we could push that up. So say you could do your reproduction between age 40 and 60 rather than 20 and 35. In a lot of ways that, according to current technology, that's a limitation. It forces us into certain behaviors at certain times. So that's my gut sense. I think that we could manage a little bit. Equally, my gut sense that 10 times the lifespan would be disastrous. That we human beings would, without the fear of death, without the inevitability of death, I think we underestimate how much that drives us in life. At the same time, I do think we would have real problems if this were possible, and then we had to make some decision to not use the technology. That might be very difficult. It might simply be the case that once this is available, we can assume that people will use it, and we better start finding a whole bunch of other places to live, whether that's on the Earth or elsewhere in the solar system, because that would be the only way we could do it. And again, that's where you don't know if maybe in 10 years we go to the moon, in 20 years we find that in fact there's loads and loads of water on the moon that would enable us to establish civilizations there, and so maybe things are possible. So, upon ethical reflection, what would you decide to recommend, and what are your reasons? How likely do you think that that some of us will face such questions in the future? So, so that's my intuitive sense. I basically say, by all means, let's live to 120, 130. Let's somehow, if possible, render that a perceived inevitability, which I think, again, in some ways is necessary for us to live the life in the way that we think we would want to. And so let me throw it out to you. What would you recommend? It's, we appreciate your membership on the committee, but before we let you go, we need to know your recommendation. So I think I won't let any of you escape. If you choose to answer in one word, that's fine, but I'd love for you to give an initial impression. So we have a volunteer?
I'll go.
Okay.
My initial reaction would be no, but I don't know if that comes from a place of fear, just because it's unknown what the consequences would be, and to me it just seems like very unnatural. So I don't know why, like, it just scares me to tamper with something that's not naturally occurring and doesn't have, I guess, not necessarily science backing it, but just time backing it. Like, you never know. I don't know, what if you inject this in people and then it like gives them rabies and then they all go crazy, and then, I don't know, like, you never know what
I
can
think
happen.
I saw that movie.
Yeah.
So fear of the unknown. So the fear of the unpredictability of this in your mind dominates.
But I also wonder, like, why do people, like you said, maybe people want to extend their life for the lovers of knowledge, but there just seems to be so many people today that are unhappy. Why would they want to extend that? And are they just thinking it's another solution to their happiness? Like, I feel
because they love being unhappy.
Yeah. But if you can find happiness in the current moment, are you going to find it if you had it another 100 years? And then I guess you could pose the argument of a lot of religions think that there's reincarnation, or this is your one of many lives, so why do you need it in this particular life? If you, once you die, you'll come back again anyways.
Well, that's a good point, especially for religions or worldviews that promise, a real and extended life after death. most of which simultaneously say you should keep people alive as long as possible, they would have a real dilemma. Do you put off the promises of the afterlife? You know, real dilemma for those types of things. All right, thanks. So let's just go around the table. So
I just want to add on to her first point. At first, I would agree with her saying that like it's kind of unnatural and just holding on to that fear of the unknown, like not knowing what would happen to you if you were to inject yourself with this foreign substance. But at the same time, like people who have so many dreams and aspirations and they don't really get to live them, or things like, for example, becoming a mother. Like, I know it's a joyful thing, but it's, in some ways, it stops you from doing what you wanted to pursue before. So if you had a little more time, maybe like a couple decades, just to be able to pursue, you know, careers or different ambitions and passions before taking on different tasks that society bestows on you, it would be kind of cool to have.
So what's your vote?
I guess I'd be like in the middle path of just having the couple decades, but not 10 times.
So yes, but just a little.
Just a little.
Okay, thank you.
I would say like, I don't know, because I agree that if it's just like to 100, like 120 or 130, it's good. So maybe if it were the case that you could then keep getting them as you need rather than have to commit to like 1,000 years at once, then maybe it'd be good to have
Well,
something that.
Yeah, but isn't it inevitable you're just gonna keep it going? If you say you
I
just
never know,
sort
because
of,
what if one time, because like she's saying, you have goals and you have things you want to do, or if you have that time to do them, you're gonna take that option, but eventually, I'm sure everyone would get to a point where they're just like, okay, I'm happy now, I'm good, and then they choose to back out. So I would say the same thing, like, yeah, it's kind of that middle path that you can kind of take it as you need, then sure, but I think to lock in right off the bat that increasing your lifespan tenfold, that'd be bad.
yeah. I mean, I just worry that idea that I'm good, I'm ready to die now. That concept depends on the sense of it, of that death is inevitable. You know, it means that, you know, sort of whenever it comes, you know, I'm okay with that. When it isn't inevitable, you know, I worry that it becomes more like, you know, a suicidal ideation that means that somehow your life is not as happy as it was. And, you know, I know that I would love for any extended life to be worthwhile, for it to be happy right through. You know, so in some sense, if you reach the point where this is kind of a waste of time, I don't need to be here anymore, it raises the question of whether it was even worth it in the first place. All right, so that's another yes, but yes, just a little.
Okay. Yeah, kind of yes.
All right.
Another kind of yes.
Yep.
You want to be off the committee?
Oh, I know, I was just like waiting for the
Oh.
yeah, it's like,
Oh.
just for the timing.
I didn't see.
I think I would kind of lean in between not having it in the middle path. And the reason why is because I think that by, you know, having these extended years in your life, you don't really appreciate what you have right now. And you as well mentioned earlier in the lecture that now when you're looking back at, when I'm looking back at high school or when I was in my younger years, I'm starting to appreciate how much more I know and how much more I've learned from that right now, and what I still have from what I still have to learn, right? But I think by having extended years in our life, it's kind of taking that away because you're not kind of living as it goes. Right?
So you fear that we would just procrastinate our way
Yeah.
and make less good use of our time?
If anything, I think I would agree to some years being given the young adulthood time, maybe right now. But but yeah, that's kind of my.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm in my early 50s looking back, and I do think that life was never better than at about 19. Because you feel like you're an adult, but you don't have any sense of responsibility. So enjoy it as you move towards or away from that.
My initial thought was use caution because with that technology, like that scenario doesn't really specify what the actual mechanism is. Like, so is it slowing the process of aging, but how is it slowing the process of aging?
It seems to work in each of your cells, so your cells just age at a slower pace.
Okay, but it could also mean that the person would still be subject to like morbidities. So while the process of aging might be slowed down, the person might still suffer.
Let's just say that along with this technology comes most human disease has been we're able to fight against it pretty well.
Okay. Yeah, then I would say use caution, and maybe this technology could be used to certain populations where they might be more vulnerable to diseases that we can't really cure, like degenerative.
Now that's interesting. I mean, this is coming from what I would assume is a justice perspective.
Mm-hmm.
What I heard you just say is that maybe we who live in places where we live to 80 before start using it for ourselves should see that people in other parts of the world where the expectation is only 60, maybe that's where we should put it so that we can level the playing field first. Again, that I would consider that an important justice consideration.
Mm-hmm. But then that would also pose risks to this being like a direct consumer thing where certain people with a lot of money could pay for this technology even if they can't really justify their use.
Well, you can certainly imagine that in the real world, as it currently looks, if this were available, it would be the super wealthy who would be the main consumers. And, so I mean, in some ways, that justice issue looms over all of our discussions about advanced future technology. And that while justice is important, human progress is also important. And the question of to what degree do we need to level the playing field and make sure that every human being has their basic needs met before we go and start spending huge amounts on advanced gains is a question that's out there.
I just have a question. Would it be like focused to consumers though? Because it's like a vaccine and stuff they're available to everyone. Would that stop them from using kind of thing?
Well, that would be the innovation. The innovation would be that we are not going to just offer this to the highest bidder. It's going to be governments or that buy it for everybody. Just like vaccines in Alberta. You can go anywhere you want, your pharmacist, and they'll give you a free vaccine. You can even get a few of them.
That was my idea. That issue she mentions is really important today. In many developing countries, as you know, the accessibility for the transparent tissue or organs are only for wealthier or very few people, and it's exactly injustice. And that young lady mentioned to the happiness. I assume the happiness depends primarily to the functioning of an individual. To what extent that man or women has functioned in society is basically, in my idea, related to the happiness. But personally, I'm with the majority of these young people
A little.
for because long the length of the or immortality is a famous desire for humankind. And because of this, I don't believe after that. Because we have a lot of desires in humankind. But agree with the majority to yes, but to some extent.
Just a little.
Yes.
Okay. Ishita, are you gonna respond?
Sure. So I think carrying on with this trend, I think the issue of who has access to it is huge, because I think in terms of the social injustice already present, I think a lot of our economy and the way we see the world depends on the fact that, at least in Western societies, our belief is that if we work hard, we can achieve what we want, and that's what, you know, capitalism is based on. But if we get to the point where it's like only the super wealthy can extend their life, just like how it's like only the super wealthy are going to be able to buy tickets to go to Mars if we start colonizing there, then I think that would rock the whole social structure, because I think at some point people are just going to get desperate and be like, I'm not going to make enough money to, you know, gain this, to add these few years to my life. So they'll go find other means to try to do it. And I think that would be, I just feel like it opens the door to a lot of dangers from, especially from the people who don't have access to it. So I think I'd say no. I'd say not even a little bit, because I think if it exists, then people are going to start exploiting it like the second it starts existing.
So you would normally say no, but that somebody should have shut down this research project years ago.
I think if there was a possibility that this could exist, I think someone would find it. Even if it was illegal, I think someone would find it. But if I had a choice, I'd probably say no.
All right, I love somebody taking a stand. You're the wishy-washy middle people.
I think we should separate these issues into two aspects. So for one group of people, or maybe for one populations of one region, actually it is very difficult to how to say to deal with this problem, to this issue, because maybe 500 years ago, maybe a lot of people will spend 10 years or 12 years to grow into some adults, and they could marry and they could have their baby and they could go into the work. But now, maybe you should spend 1/3 of your life to finish those things. But once the people inject or accept these technologies, the percentage of the time you grow into the adult or go into the world will reduce again. So it will take a long time to adjust for those people, for our human beings to adjust to this situation. So I think this process should be painful, should be a long time, and maybe a lot of people will lose their targets. But don't know. Oh, I still have 100 years to live, so maybe it will lose the targets, and our society may be far into the situation that is undeveloped, just like in our ancient time. So but I believe that our human being will try our best to develop ourselves and to adjust this situation, but it was a long time. This is not about the source, the resource. It is just about how to just like adapt, yeah.
So you're saying yes, but with caution.
Yeah.
And it sounds like you're persuaded that the fear of our own death
Yeah.
is a major thing that drives human behavior and self-identity.
Yeah. Oh, I still have another aspect, sorry.
Sorry.
So, for another aspect, for individuals, especially for those rich person, I think there's no middle path for them. Because I think for those people, they will try to purchase, to obtain the technology, even they lost anything or others, they will try to expand their life. Even you have the law, you have the policy, so it is. So for these issues, I think you should separate into two aspects to consider it.
Yes. So I think what I hear you saying is that some people, particularly the wealthy, will continue to pursue the fountain of youth,
Yeah,
motivated strongly by their fear of death.
yeah,
And the power that they get from their wealth will drive at least some of them to do that vigorously.
yeah.
So I do think, thank you committee members, that would be an important thing, is whether we can put the genie in the bottle at all. Dr. Solis?
So, often questions like this assume that everything else stays the same and you're just changing one thing. So let me say that, first of all, something like this is going to happen. It may not be exactly like what you've described, but like the fact that computers solved Go 10 to 15 years before we thought means that, spectacular things of some sort are going to happen. And I would certainly be in favor of this thing that you have described, but as each person described it, it's with identity being exactly the same as it is now. Our sense of personhood being exactly the same. And think of how that could change so it is remarkably different, and how that would affect everything that you've said about this. Like, if there's not one of you, but much less than one, suppose that your sense of self is much diluted by the fact that most of your brain is a brain implant that's a certain brand that's similar to other people's brain implant, and most of the bright ideas come from the implant rather than remaining, biological brain. That means that the personhood of you, the identity is somehow shrunk, right? So that's one possibility. The other is what I've been talking about with is multiple instances of you somehow, that you're not constantly making choices because you can only do one thing. That's no longer the case, that you can go to college and fight pirates in the high seas and all this. The various fantasies that you have about doing things in life. There may be a way you could pursue them all and test yourself in all the ways that you'd like to be tested simultaneously.
Any speculation about the nature of human love in relationship with when you've got multiple?
Yeah, well, one thing is that to the extent that this is virtual reality, and that virtual reality would be maybe as good as, or sometimes better than real reality, this could be shared. And you might have someone with whom you shared all this stuff. And so your, multiple instances of yourself and their multiple instances would be sort of partnered, right? You'd be going, like the Star Trek crew, right? To new places, new, adventures. So you could imagine that, yeah, it becomes very complicated how you maintain intimate relationships, or maybe those relationships are just much more exciting and you know, enduring than they ever were before, because you can have these multiple simultaneous paired, you know, experiences, the two of you. And both of those things, I don't think they're quite like, you know, apocalypse and utopia, because you can think of pluses and minuses of both, you know, like suppose you're part of the Borg and, you know, much of your consciousness is a shared consciousness, but it might be that that consciousness does just awesome things that you can't conceive ever having been able to do those things on your own.
They're happy on the inside, they just don't look happy.
Yes, yes. Yeah, so maybe that wouldn't be so bad. And the idea of running multiple lives simultaneously is that we would have the intellect to keep track of everything and to, you know, take all those experiences in. We tried to do that now, we'd simply get mixed up and we'd lose track of which alive was which, you know, just be a mess. But on the other hand, all these postulates that machines will become more intelligent and so will we. What do we need all that intellect for? This would give it something to do, to keep all these multiple lives or multiple simultaneous experiences straight. And if it seems impossible to you, there are already video games where you can do this. You know, you can control like 5 characters at once. It's called multi-boxing. And, you know, there's a question of, okay, how much of this would be the biological you and how much it would, but, so I just point out that the parameters of everything about the future are open, right? It's not just whether we live forever or not, or live an extra 60, 80 years or not, but also not only how long we live, but what human identity is really like. Does our name matter? Does it matter as much as today? Does it matter only 10% as much as today? Does it matter 10 times as much? You know, maybe Gary Goldsand is 100 people or 1,000 people doing things all over the universe, you know, and like, you're a brand, right? You're not just one person, you're a brand doing stuff. You know, you can imagine that. Or you can imagine that each of our names hardly matter at all because we're not really responsible for much of what we do in terms of our, you know, biological brains. So both of those things are possible.
So it sounds like you're a yes.
I'm a yes, but yes, yeah, sure. No, I think in the scenario you presented, I am a yes, but I also want to point out it's impossible that we could be at that point and the identity challenges that I just mentioned would not also have, you know, confronted us. That will also happen.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. Well, thank you very much. I glad to hear your honesty and your reasoning. You seem to be committed, at least to some degree, to the need to find compromise in these things. You know, I hope that you accept how difficult it might be to control, but at the same thing, as Dr. Solis suggests, hopefully along with this will come a bunch of other technologies that will make it easier to get your mind around. You know, and then I could just finish by saying that I can't imagine you know, a time in the decades to come where even if we have all of these things, even if the robots do all our work, our lives are lives of leisure, we can be in two places at once and experience all of that. I can't see us getting away from our fundamental animal nature, being drawn to the other, the affairs of the heart, finding other people that you're attracted to or not, will continue, I think, to animate us, which means that there will not only be an increase in love, but things like heartbreak and jealousy will continue to be a part of what the human condition is, potentially setting the stage for conflict. So hopefully you take as much pleasure in all of us as trying to imagine these future things in some semi-realistic way, recognizing that it's really hard to get your head around all of this stuff.
So I just like to make a pitch for student feedback. And in essence, the question Gary posed at the start, we don't have to talk about it now, but you spent some time writing that. Why don't you send those things to me? What did you think was like the greatest ethical challenge? And I'll send them on to Gary and so on. Then we'll have that, and that will have some influence over what we do in the future.
Yeah, if it were 5 minutes ago, I'd ask you to read them now, but we can do it by email.
Yeah, and similarly, when we send you the questionnaire about the course, fill it out. Realize that this is the principal way in which the course changes, and that in recent years, I mean, the students used to give really short, telegraphic answers, and then the student just wrote page after page. And then other students heard about that and started to do the same thing. So there's no limit. You can write as much as you want. You can give us grand ideas about new things. That's just great. I like that. And if I mean, you must have had an idea of what you were looking for in this course. And so to what extent did we satisfy that? To what extent do you have ideas about how we can make things even better? So we welcome all of that. And we'll see you on Thursday. Thank you.